All right, we are in Numbers 22. We have been studying Balak and Balaam. We've covered Balak, and now we've moved on to Balaam. And we've noted how that the children of Israel back in chapter 21, it was their intention to go up by the King's Highway and kind of cross over the Jordan north of the land of the Amorites. However, they asked permission from the king of the Amorites, and he got all up in a huff and said no, and so they went and fought against them and destroyed them. The Israelites destroyed the Amorites and took over the plains of Moab, and that's what got Balak upset, Balak being the king of Moab, and he became concerned about the children of Israel being so close, and so he, as well as the Midianites and the Ammonites, as we're told, they seek after this man named Balaam up in Pethor, which is about 500 miles north from Moab. And they bring Balaam back with them because Balaam had a reputation of being one who, when he cursed a people or a person, they were cursed, and when they were blessed, they were blessed. And so there was this sense of sorcery, this sense of diviner type of association or reputation with Balaam. Attached to that, I do want to make a correction to something we discussed last week regarding Balaam on our notes. I mentioned the fact that not once was he ever called a prophet. And I don't know how I missed this reference, but that's not entirely accurate. So I've changed it to not once was he ever called a prophet of God. In 2 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 15, which is a passage we're going to get to in a little while anyway, Peter is describing their pseudo teachers. They're not just false teachers, they're fake teachers. And they have malicious intent and malicious character. And Peter says in verse 15, they have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. But he was rebuked for his iniquity. A dumb donkey, speaking with a man's voice, restrained the madness of the prophet. And again, I don't know how I missed that particular reference, but that term prophet there, it means foreteller, and that term is often used in association with the prophets of Israel. However, it's not exclusive to the prophets of Israel. And so just because in verse 16, Peter refers to Balaam as a prophet does not mean he's referring to him as a prophet of Jehovah or a prophet of God. Because in Titus chapter 1, we see Paul make a reference to those in Crete. He refers to their attitude and their mindset, verse 12. One of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. And as far as I can tell, Paul's not referencing there in verse 12. In fact, there are external references kind of referring back to what Paul's talking about. That he's not talking about a prophet of Jehovah. He's talking about one of the prophets of Crete, one of the false god prophets who referred to his own people in that way. And so I don't believe Paul's referencing someone with the gifts of the Holy Spirit who said this about them, but rather one of their own false prophets or prophets of idolatry or whatnot. But regardless, I do want to make that correction. I've made it on our big notes, but not once was he ever called a prophet of God. And as we noticed last week, he received a diviner's fee. He was referred to as a soothsayer in Joshua. He sought to use sorcery in Numbers 24. The third time that he is supposed to curse the people of God. And the first two times, instead of cursing them, he blessed them. The third time, Joshua 24 and verse 1, it says that instead of like at other times he sought to use sorcery, this time he didn't. And so it seems clear that Balaam was not a true prophet of Jehovah. But as we talked about last week, it seems as though he kind of, whichever God was being called upon, he was kind of the prophet to all the gods, so to speak. And in fact, we're told back in Numbers chapter 22 that the fact God refers to the fact that his way was perverse before him. And so I think that's important to note, that I don't think in any aspect of this was he a true prophet of Jehovah, and I think that that's important to note. Any thoughts through that?
In the Old West, they talk about a hired gun, he was a hired prophet.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly, and we actually talked about a little bit also the fact that back in Numbers 22, we talked a little bit about the fact that he refers to the Lord my God, and by using this reference, he refers to Yahweh my Elohim. And we talked about that a little bit last week. And I mentioned that the Hebrew here, there is no term for my. There's no personal pronoun here in the actual Hebrew text, and there's not. Let's see, I can't do two things at the same time here. And in verse 18. Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or more. And the question came up, well, if he says my God, then is he acknowledging that he belongs to Jehovah, or that he's a prophet of Jehovah? And there isn't a Hebrew term here that's my Jehovah. However, I did a little bit of research in the Hebrew, and apparently in order to acknowledge personal pronouns, my, possessive pronouns, or even gender pronouns, her house, his house, they would combine the pronoun with the actual term. And so there was a punctuation right ahead of the actual word being referenced. And here with Elohim, there is that punctuation of him saying or acknowledging my God. Okay, but I contend that even if we're talking about Baal, he would say the Lord my Baal, or however they referenced Baal. Okay, he was, as Nolan put it, he was a prophet for hire. And so, of course, he's going to suggest some connection, some special connection to whatever God it is that they're referencing. Now, how does he know that there's no way Jehovah's going to let me curse this people if he tells me I can't curse these people? Well, I don't know. Again, did he have past experience with somebody calling on Jehovah? Had God revealed to him maybe more than what we have given to us here, where he originally goes to call on Jehovah? Jehovah tells him, do not go with these men. Maybe there was a little bit more dialogue there. Even if you did, I wouldn't let you do it anyway. Maybe there was. And so regardless, what we see here with, as I said, the first and second times here, they come to Balaam. They ask him to go with them. And as we noted at the end of last week, we see in verse 19, Balaam says, all right, you stay here tonight that I may know more what the Lord will say to me. So then in verse 20, God came to Balaam. He says, if the men come to call you, rise and go with them, but only the word I speak to you that you shall do. And it's interesting because you read some commentaries about this, and they think that in some form or fashion, and of course, a lot of the commentaries actually do contend that Balaam was a true prophet of Jehovah. Okay, well, if he was, and let's say that he was for a moment, if he was a bad one. All right, first of all, his attitude and his character was not of what Jehovah would want from any of his prophets. In fact, out of all of the prophets that we know names of and examples of, if this man is truly a prophet of Jehovah, he's the worst one of the lot. Okay, all the others were faithful men. They were men of upstanding character. They were willing to suffer for the things that he told them to say. This man, however, was greedy. He sought kind of loopholes out of things. He jumped to assumptions about certain things. But here in verse 20, God tells him, if the men come and call you, presumably to come a third time. You're not allowed to go this time. But if they come and call you a third time, that's fine. But then we see in verse 21, so then in the morning, Balaam, he saddles his donkey and he goes with the princes of Moab. And then in verse 22, God's anger was aroused. And some of the commentaries suggest, well, Balaam should have known better, even though God, quote unquote, gave him permission. And I don't see that at all. I don't see God giving him permission in verse 20. Because otherwise, God would have said, rise and go with them, but only the word I speak to you, that you shall do. He wouldn't have bothered saying, if the men come to call you. wouldn't bother saying that. Well, the men had already called this second time. Okay, well, to me, the way I read what God says, if they return again a third time, then you may go. He doesn't wait for the third time. Instead, he saddles up. He kind of hears what he wants to hear. And so in verse 22, we see God's anger being aroused. Any thoughts through that? All right. So now here starting in verse 22, we have the situation with the talking donkey. And that's the reference that Peter made regarding the dumb donkey. What does the term dumb mean? Can't speak. He's mute. Okay, it doesn't have the same connotation or meaning that our society tends to use the term dumb. Shouldn't have been able to speak, and yet God allowed it to speak. And what we see in verse 22 is that he sent an angel of the Lord to stand in the way as an adversary against Balaam. And he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. Now the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the way and went into the field. So Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back onto the road. The angel of the Lord stood a narrow path, here's the second time, verse 24, between the vineyards, with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed herself against the wall and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall, so he struck her again. Then in verse 26, the angel of the Lord, here's a third time, he went further and stood at a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. So Balaam's anger was aroused, and he struck the donkey with his staff. So it took those three times, and now all of a sudden, the donkey is going to be able to speak. The Lord opens the mouth of the donkey, verse 28. Some people wonder, is this the actual donkey talking? Are animals able to talk if God gives them the ability to do so? Is this a God speaking through the donkey type of situation? Is it a temporary intelligence that the donkey receives in this moment? Well, one thing's for sure, it's a miracle, okay? Because other than, Mr. Ed? Or is he a horse? Is he a donkey or a horse? Horse. So other than, in TV shows and movies, animals can't talk, all right? So this is definitely a miracle. And so the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these three times?" Now, I personally tend to think that this is God for, at least on a temporary basis, giving the donkey the ability to express itself. Okay? Now, there's a question in our notes, and I'm going to go ahead and cover it now because we're here. What gender was Balaam's donkey? She. Now, why is this interesting? Why is that interesting? Why is it interesting that that's recorded? The donkey spoke. Absolutely. And the fact that you have the detail of that this is a she donkey. Okay, that detail in and of itself, that multiple times you've got this gender association of her, of she. And then as Nick mentioned in verse 28, she said to Balaam, first of all, not the Lord said to Balaam, through the donkey. Okay, it wasn't the angel of the Lord through the donkey. The donkey spoke to Balaam and says, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these three times?" And as if this was a common occurrence, which, remember we talked last week about Balaam and just throwing out there the possibility that maybe, this is a fella. A lot of times mental disorders were kind of taken in ancient times as being touched by the gods. And suppose he heard voices. Maybe he really didn't think anything of Jehovah talking to him earlier in chapter 22. Well, weirdly enough, verse 29, does Balaam even, at least according to what's recorded, does he even stop to consider that a donkey's talking to me? Okay, maybe this is something that happened a lot for him. Okay, I don't know, and I have no evidence to say that he had, any kind of mental disorder where he's hearing voices. But it's interesting to me that in verse 29, Balaam said to the donkey, "Because you've abused me, I wish there were a sword in my hand, for now I would kill you."
You have to wonder how the two servants are observing all this.
And we don't have their reaction, do we? And whether or not, for that matter, all right, whether or not they even heard the donkey speak. Maybe the donkey did its whole hee-haw thing, and what What Balaam's hearing are words, but what everybody else is hearing is just a donkey hawing. I don't know. It may be a similar situation as to that which happened on the road to Damascus with Paul, where Paul's hearing, he understands the Hebrew, whereas those with him, they heard a voice, but they couldn't understand it, and maybe they just didn't know the Hebrew. But regardless, we don't have the reaction of the other two servants, or for that matter, where these princes of Moab are in this caravan. Presumably these princes weren't alone. Surely they brought soldiers with them or somebody to protect them in this 500-mile trek. So at some point, maybe heading up the rear of this caravan or something along that line, this is taking place. But I think it's really interesting that Balaam has no reaction out of the ordinary here, as if this happens all the time. And for him, maybe it did. Who knows?
People get really mad. Fly off the handle if they lose all sense of reason. Some people do.
Yeah. Sense of reality goes out the window.
Go unhinged and they're not even aware of what the circumstances are.
Yeah, it could be. Because this is the third time this has happened. And so he's really upset. In fact, he's upset to the point where I would have killed you by this point. And in verse 30, the donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey on which you have ridden ever since I became yours to this day? Was I ever disposed to do this to you?" And he said, "No." And again, this is why I think that the donkey is the one speaking. Okay? And again, whether or not this was a temporary thing that God allowed the donkey to have this intelligence and this ability to speak as well, or if donkeys have some kind of remembrance of certain things, which I doubt. I tend to think that this is kind of a dual miracle here, the ability not only to speak, but to speak as if it's talking like a person. But what she brings up is the fact that, how long have I had you? Have I ever acted this way? And Balaam says, "No, you haven't." So obviously something's changed. Something's different. Something's happening here. Then in verse 31, and again, I think it's interesting as well that the Lord allowed, first of all, the donkey to see the angel of the Lord standing in the way. That's the first thing. Okay, apparently the donkey was able to see it when Balaam wasn't, those 3 times. But also the fact that the donkey apparently perceived that danger that existed for Balaam. Again, I tend to think it's all part of the same grouping of miracles here, that the donkey even thought anything about it. Okay, but much less the fact that there's some danger, because God, the way God says it, the donkey saved your life. In verse 31, the Lord opened Balaam's eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And he bowed his head and fell flat on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to stand against you, because your way is perverse before me." Now, certainly I think that applies to the fact that he disobeyed Jehovah. Going back to verse 20, he was told to wait for a 3rd time and he didn't. But I think you could very well, given the other adjectives and ways in which he's described as a diviner, a soothsayer, using sorcery, I tend to think that this wasn't limited to just him disobeying God back in verse 20. I think that this is his whole livelihood, this whole persona he's built up as a prophet to the gods type of thing. I tend to think God is referring to that as being perverse. Then in verse 33, the donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely I would also have killed you by now and let her live. I think that's an interesting detail, that it's not the donkey's fault. Okay? The donkey actually saved your life. And again, whether or not God allowed her to perceive this danger, certainly the angel of the Lord's in the way, and so she's not going to run over a person necessarily, but it seems like there's a little bit more understanding there than that maybe. But regardless, God says, if she had not turned aside and she'd kept walking, you would be killed, you would be dead. She wouldn't, because she hasn't done anything wrong. Thoughts or comments? All right, verse 34. Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned, for I did not know you stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back." So verse 34 also to me again suggests that Balaam heard what he wanted to hear when God said, if they come again, you can go with them, but only what I tell you to say, that's what you're going to be able to say. I tend to think that Balaam heard what he wanted, and so when he says in verse 34, I didn't know that you stood in the way against me. I think he convinced himself that it's okay for me to go. And it also doesn't make sense if some of these commentators are saying in verse 34, well, God had technically given him permission, but he should have known better. To me, that would be unjust against Balaam if that were the case. And yet what Balaam says is, therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back. Well, we know what's in Balaam's heart. Okay, what's one of the motivations in Balaam's heart kind of prompting all this anyway? Greed. Yeah. Okay, Balak basically promised him the moon, and Balak promised him the moon. Balaam wants it, and so he's trying to find a way to reason this out here. And in verse 35, I'm going to give him credit at least for saying, if it displeases you, I'll turn back. I didn't realize that this was going to be a thing. You know, you'd be upset at me about this whole thing. Verse 35, the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men, but only the word that I speak to you, that you shall speak. And so Balaam went with the princes of Balak. Any thoughts through verse 35? All right, now, remember last week we talked a little bit about this issue of why wouldn't Balaam just curse the people? Why wouldn't he just say those words? And again, as I mentioned last week, I believe that God literally would not allow him to curse his people. He wouldn't allow him to curse Israel. And this is why Balaam even said earlier that no matter what I do, I will not be able to say anything other than what the Lord tells me to say. Again, whether the Lord had made that clear the first time the men had come or what. But Jehovah's not going to let him curse his people. Not that Balaam had any special powers. It's not like if Balaam had actually cursed his people, that they literally would be cursed. Like there's some power that can prevent God from keeping his people safe. I don't believe that to be the case. However, from the political perspective, who's going to kind of get on a thought process? All right, now we can defeat them. Balak. And remember, it's not just Balak and Moab that are involved in this. The princes of Midian are involved, as well as the Ammonites are involved. Okay, and as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that Balak didn't know was that Israel had been commanded not to mess with Moab or the Ammonites, because from whose ancestry did they come? From Lot. Yeah, with his two daughters. So the Moabites and the Ammonites, they came from Lot. And God specifically told them, you do not touch the Ammonites or the Moabites because of Lot. I have given them, his descendants, those lands. So they weren't to fight against Lot's descendants. Midian was a different story. And the Amorites were a different story. But Midian and Ammon were no touchy. Verse 36, Balak heard that Balaam was coming. He went out to meet him at the city of Moab, which is on the border of the Arnon. In fact, we saw that in our map here. Let's see. Yeah, there's the Arnon River right here. This is the border between Moab and the Amorites. And so he's going out to meet Balaam here in verse 37. He says, did I not earnestly send to you, calling for you? Why did you not come to me? Am I not able to honor you? And ironically, I mean, it would have been 3 times, actually, if Balaam had done what he was supposed to do. But as it was, remember, that's a 500-mile trip one way. So it's 15 now, it's 2,000 miles, because technically they've made 2 round trips. Balaam said to Balak in verse 38, look, I've come to you. Now have I any power at all to say anything? The word that God puts in my mouth, that I must speak. Now, again, to me, that's indicative of him literally, he's acknowledging that I literally cannot say anything other than what Jehovah's going to tell me to say. I don't have any choice in the matter. And I think that is what he's expressing here. It's not just like, okay, I want you to bless my people, do not curse them. Here's what I want you to say. And then Balaam is able to get up and then curse the people anyway. First of all, that would not be a wise thing for Balaam to do anyway, because, the wrath of Jehovah. But I don't believe Balaam had that ability. When it came to cursing his people or blessing his people, he's going to say what God puts in his mouth. And in verse 39, Balaam went with Balak. They came to Kirjath Huzoth. Balak offered oxen and sheep, so he offers up these sacrifices, presumably to their own gods, not to Jehovah. Okay, these offerings of oxen and sheep, I don't believe had anything to do with some sacrifice to Jehovah. And then in verse 41, it was the next day that Balak took Balaam and brought him to the high places of Baal, that from there he might observe the extent of the people. Now, remember when we were talking about Balak, what he does is he starts off with the full extent of the people. Here's the whole multitude of Israel. So they're probably at the very highest place they can get, above the plains of Moab, to see the full extent of the children of Israel. Well, then in chapter 23, we have Balaam, even though Balaam's supposed to curse the people, instead he blesses the people. He says in verse 1, Balaam says, build 7 altars for me here, prepare here 7 bulls and 7 rams. And so he did. And then in verse 3, stand by your burnt offering and I will go. Perhaps the Lord will come to meet me, and whatever he shows me, I will tell you. So he went to a desolate height in verse 3. Now, remember, these first 2 times, we're told in chapter 24 and in verse 1, that these times he went to use sorcery when he did this. Presumably these sacrifices were involved in this sorcery. And so the third time, remember, now when Balaam saw it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as at other times to seek to use sorcery, but he set his face to the wilderness. So this first time that he goes to seek the words of Jehovah for Israel, sounds like he's attempting to use sorcery, whatever rituals or whatever was involved with that. Again, kind of speaking to that mystic, occult type of mentality that he's kind of the prophet to the gods type of thing. And so in verse 4, God met Balaam and he said to him, I have prepared the 7 altars and I have offered each an altar, a bull, and a ram. Again, I don't believe that this is commanded by Jehovah. This is something I believe that he probably did for any of the gods that he would appeal to. Okay, I don't believe that this is necessarily something God says that here's what I want you to do. This is just what he did anyway, to appeal to any of the gods, I tend to think. Verse 5, the Lord put a word in Balaam's mouth and said, return to Balak, and thus you shall speak. So Balaam returned to Balak, and there he was standing by his burnt offering, he and all the princes of Moab, and he took up his oracle and said, and so starting in verse 7 and into verse 10, he offers up what ends up being a blessing instead of a curse. And so, like in verse 10, who can count the dust of Jacob or number 1/4 of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous and let my end be like his. And in verse 11, Balak said to Balaam, what have you done to me? I took you to curse my enemies, and look, you blessed them bountifully. Now, again, I don't believe Balaam had any control over what he was saying. This was God's blessing to his people. I don't think Balaam had the ability to just say, you know what, I'm going to change it. I'm going to kind of maybe not necessarily so cited for Israel. Let me kind of make it a little bit equalizing here. He wasn't able to do that. And I think his words to Balak back in chapter 22 were literal. God's going to tell me what to say, and I will not be able to say anything else. And so in verse 12, he answered and said, must I not take heed to speak what the Lord has put in my mouth? And I believe that's literal there in verse 12. Thoughts or comments to that first blessing that was supposed to be a curse?
In verse 5 and 12, the word isn't there. I'm not arguing with that. But isn't that pretty much the definition of a prophet? Again, I'm not pushing that he's a full-time prophet for God. But
right.
In this particular case, he is.
Well, he is a mouthpiece for God's word is being spoken through him. And in fact, there's going to be a fourth speaking. Okay, it's not going to be a fourth blessing of Israel necessarily, but there will be at the end in chapter 24, there is going to be a telling of the future, a literal prophesying. But again, I believe that God's literally putting that in his mouth. God is using his mouth to speak his word. And so from a literal perspective, he is literally prophesying. He's speaking the word of God. From a character perspective, he's not a prophet of Jehovah, I don't think. But yes, from a literal...
Jonah, you can't just go strictly on character. Jonah wouldn't fit in there either. You can't disqualify him as a prophet of God strictly based on that.
Yeah. I wouldn't.
Definitely better than that.
Yeah, I wouldn't put Jonah in the same boat as Balaam, but yeah, Jonah did attempt to run away. certainly. And he saw it. He was upset because he wanted to see them destroyed. But certainly I think Jonah was of the people of the Lord, whereas Balaam, I don't believe is. But yeah, that's true. You don't just go on character by itself. That's true. All right, any thoughts through that?
Well, and just the other point is that all the prophets, Peter tells us, 2 Peter 1, that the men of old spoke as the Holy Spirit gave them utterance.
Yes.
So they weren't speaking of their own authority. It was what God was telling them to say.
Well, yeah, you're right. The one caveat to that I would add, though, is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14 regarding everything being done decently and in order, and in the context of miraculous gifts, prophesying and speaking in tongues is being brought up. And Paul mentions there that the Spirit of God was subject to the spirit of the prophets, which is to say they could control when they spoke. And at the very least, they could control when they spoke, I would say. Peter refers to being oracles of God. That doesn't mean necessarily that God took away the personality from the things that they said. Now, again, whether that was a little bit different in the Old Testament compared to the New Testament, that might be. And when they spoke might be different than what they specifically said. That might be different also. But that's one caveat in 1 Corinthians 14 that Paul says, hey, you're able to control it. You're able to control when you get up to say whatever the Spirit wants you to say. But it might very well be that even in the New Testament, that didn't mean that they could add their own commentary to what was being said, that they had to literally speak what was being said by the Spirit of God. And as I believe what's happening with Balaam here. Yeah. All right. So then the second time, so now Balak says, fine, let's try this again. But this time he's going to take them to a place, verse 13, you shall only see the outer part of them. So I think Balak thinks that he's intimidated. Balaam is intimidated by seeing the multitude and how many people there are, and Balaam didn't want to side on the wrong side here. And so instead, I'll take you to a point where you can't see all the people. You can just see the outer portion of them. And so he brought them to the field of Zophim, and they built 7 altars once again. And then the same exact thing happens. Verse 16, the Lord meets Balaam, put a word in his mouth and said, now go back, and this is what you're going to say. So he goes back. And in verse 18, he took up his oracle and said, rise up, Balak, and hear. Listen to me, son of Zippor. And then he offers up this was ultimately a blessing for his own people. In verse 21, what's interesting is he says, he has not observed iniquity in Jacob, nor has he seen wickedness in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and the shout of a king is among them. God brings them out of Egypt. He has a strength like wild ox. For there is no sorcery against Jacob, nor any divination against Israel. It now must be said of Jacob and of Israel, oh, what God has done. I think that's really interesting because it's Balaam who apparently appeals to divination and sorcery, and then Jehovah uses Balaam to basically condemn Balaam's livelihood. And so again, that seems to reiterate to me that this isn't Balaam speaking, this is God's word speaking. Because Balaam, why would Balaam basically say that there is no divination or sorcery against Jehovah? You can't use divination and sorcery against God's people. Why would Balaam say that when that's his whole thing? I mean, that's all he's got. And so again, I believe this is Jehovah speaking it, and he doesn't have much of a choice here. Verse 24, look, a people rises like a lioness, lifts up like a lion. It shall not lie down until it devours the prey, and drinks the blood of the slain. I think it's interesting, though, in all three of these situations, not once does Jehovah say anything about the fact that, listen, Balak, I told my people not to mess with you or the Ammonites. So why are you upset? Why are you worried? Don't worry about it. He doesn't say that. Okay, again, this is a way of acknowledging, first of all, the sin of Balaam, okay, for one thing, but also the power of Jehovah over the false gods. I mean, they went up to the places of Baal earlier. You know, these false gods that the Ammonites and the Moabites, that they worshipped, this is Jehovah exalting himself above them. And this is also Jehovah putting fear in the hearts of any of the enemies of Israel. Even though he's not going to allow Moab and Ammon to go up to war against Israel, that's beside the point. That fear of Jehovah, the fear of his people, needs to be in the hearts of, certainly, especially as they're about to cross the Jordan to go into Canaan as well. So then in verse 25, Balak said to Balaam, neither curse them at all nor bless them at all. I asked you to curse them, you bless them, just don't say anything. Or don't, kind of be, as you bless them, why don't you bless us too in some way? Why are you being so one-sided here? What is going on? And in verse 26, Balaam said, did I not tell you, saying all that the Lord speaks, that I must do? Balak said to Balaam, please come, I'll take you another place. Perhaps it'll please God that you may curse them for me from there. Balak's not very swift, I don't think. Okay, because remember, Balak is asking Balaam to appeal to the Lord. Okay, now, they don't apparently know about Israel's relationship with Jehovah, but yet Jehovah has made it clear in these first two blessings that these are my people, and I'm going to take care of them. And Balak is still asking that maybe call upon God to curse these people. And so now they go to a place, verse 28, that overlooks the wasteland. Presumably from here, you can't see Israel. Okay, so they kind of saw the whole people. Now they just saw the outskirts of the people. Now there's none. Okay, there's nothing to intimidate you, Balaam. Then in verse 29, once again, 7 altars. Verse 30, Balak did as Balaam had said and offered a bull and a ram on every altar. And then in chapter 24, as we mentioned in verse 1, he saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel. He did not go as at other times to seek to use sorcery. Balaam apparently figured out that it wasn't his sorcery and his little rituals that were bringing about this information from Jehovah. It was just Jehovah talking to him, telling him what to say. But he set his face toward the wilderness. And then we see in verse 2 that these words are not coming from Balaam. It says the Spirit of God came upon him. Okay, so this is God speaking through Balaam. And so he took up his oracle and said, the utterance of Balaam the son of Beor. And then notice in verse 10. Okay, so verse 9, notice, blessed is he who blesses you, cursed is he who curses you. And then in verse 10, Balak's anger was aroused against Balaam, and he struck his hands together. And Balak said to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies. And look, you have bountifully blessed them these 3 times. Now therefore flee to your place. And I said I would greatly honor you, but in fact the Lord has kept you back from honor. Now I think it's interesting that Balak doesn't just put him to death. Okay, I kind of find that interesting. Suggests to me that Balak maybe was afraid of Balaam. Maybe, Balak already was convinced that Balaam has some kind of sorcerer powers, and so maybe he's afraid he's going to curse him or something like that. But regardless, he says, just go home. Just go away. And I'm not going to pay you. All the stuff that I said I was going to do and give you, that's not happening because the Lord has kept you back from that honor. But then Balaam said in verse 12, did I not speak to your messengers whom you sent to me, saying, I told you from the beginning, the very first time, that I didn't come. I sent the messengers back, and then Balak turned around and sent greater princes than those the second time. He says, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord to do good or bad of my own will. Notice that in verse 13. He specifically acknowledges that it has nothing to do with my own will. What the Lord says, that I must speak. And now indeed I'm going to my people. Come, I will advise you what this people will do to your people in the latter days. So then you have in verse 15 this final, which ends up being a fourth. This isn't a fourth blessing. It's a prophecy. This is what's going to happen later. And so we will pick that up with that and finish up our study on Balaam and Balak next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody.